Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'm a psychiatric nurse at Riverside Mental Health Facility in Portland, Oregon, or at least I was until I submitted my resignation last week. You can call me Sarah Chen if you want, though most people in the psychiatric ward just called me Nurse Chen during my first and only month there. I've worked in healthcare for 8 years, starting as a medical assistant and working my way up through various specialties: pediatrics, oncology, emergency medicine, and finally what I thought would be my calling in psychiatric nursing. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about mental health treatment and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Riverside Mental Health Facility is a 180-bed psychiatric hospital serving the greater Portland metropolitan area. It's a modern facility built in the early 2000s with specialized units for acute care, long-term treatment, and forensic psychiatry. The building itself is designed to feel less institutional than traditional psychiatric hospitals, with natural lighting, artwork on the walls, and common areas that attempt to create a therapeutic environment. During my brief time there, I worked primarily on the acute care unit, which handled patients experiencing severe mental health crises requiring immediate intervention and stabilization. The acute care unit at Riverside operates on a 24-hour staffing model with 3 shifts covering around-the-clock patient care. Day shift runs from 7 a.m. to 7:09 p.m., evening shift from 3:00 p.m. to 11:00 p.m., and night shift from 11:00 p.m. to 7:00 a.m. Each shift has its own rhythm and challenges. Day shift is typically the busiest with doctor rounds, therapy sessions, family visits, and medication adjustments. Evening shift focuses on helping patients wind down from the day's activities and preparing them for rest. Night shift, which I had been assigned to after completing my orientation, is generally quieter but can be unpredictable when patients experience sleep disturbances, nightmares, or psychiatric emergencies. I had completed my 3-week orientation program and was beginning my first solo night shift on October 3, 2023. The orientation had been thorough, covering everything from de-escalation techniques and medication administration to emergency procedures and documentation requirements. I felt as prepared as anyone could be for working in psychiatric nursing, but nothing in my training or previous healthcare experience had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. The night shift on October 3rd started routinely enough. I arrived at 10:45 p.m. to receive report from the evening shift charge nurse, Margaret Rodriguez, who had been working at Riverside for over 15 years. Margaret was known for her calm demeanor and encyclopedic knowledge of every patient on the unit. She walked me through the status of our 32 patients, highlighting those who might need extra attention during the overnight hours. Most of the patients were settling in for the night. We had the usual mix of diagnoses: major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse issues. Several patients were on suicide watch, requiring checks every 15 minutes throughout the night. Others were dealing with medication adjustments that could cause sleep disturbances or unusual behavior. Margaret noted that 2 patients had been particularly agitated during the evening and might require additional monitoring. The patient who would change everything for me was admitted just as Margaret was finishing her report. At 11:20 p.m., security escorted a new admission to our unit. The patient was a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s with shoulder-length brown hair and an unusually calm demeanor for someone being brought to a psychiatric facility. She was wearing standard-issue hospital scrubs, having already been processed through the emergency department downstairs. What immediately struck me about this patient was how composed she seemed. Most new admissions to our acute care unit arrive in some state of distress, whether that's agitation, confusion, depression, or psychosis. They're often frightened, angry, or overwhelmed by the circumstances that brought them to our facility. This woman walked onto our unit as if she were simply checking into a hotel. She made eye contact with staff, observed her surroundings with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, and responded to questions with polite nods and brief verbal acknowledgments. Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, The attending psychiatrist on call had already completed the initial psychiatric evaluation in the emergency department. According to the admission paperwork, the patient had been brought in by police after being found wandering downtown Portland at 2:01 a.m. the previous morning. She'd been discovered sitting on a bench outside Pioneer Courthouse Square, apparently talking to herself and showing signs of disorientation and confusion. When officers approached her, she could not provide her name, address, or any identifying information. The police report indicated that she had been cooperative but seemed disconnected from reality. She told officers that she was waiting for someone to come get her, but couldn't explain who that person was or how they would know where to find her. She had no identification, no personal belongings, and was wearing clothes that appeared to be several sizes too large for her frame. A thorough search of missing persons reports yielded no matches to her description. After spending 2 days in the emergency department undergoing medical clearance and initial psychiatric assessment, she was being admitted to our unit for further evaluation and treatment. The working diagnosis was brief psychotic disorder with possible dissociative features. Though Dr. Yamamoto noted in her admission notes that the patient's presentation was unusual and didn't fit neatly into any standard diagnostic category, I was assigned to be her primary nurse for the night shift, which meant I would be responsible for her initial orientation to the unit, medication administration, and ongoing assessment of her mental status. Margaret walked me through the standard admission procedures and noted that the patient had been cooperative throughout the emergency department stay, but had provided very little information about herself or her circumstances. The patient's room was in the middle section of our unit, close to the nurse's station where we could maintain visual contact while still providing her with privacy. As I approached her room to begin the admission process, I could see her through the reinforced glass window, sitting quietly on the edge of her bed and looking around the room with what appeared to be methodical observation rather than the confusion or fear I typically saw in new admissions. When I knocked on her door and introduced myself, she looked up at me with remarkably clear, intelligent eyes and said, "Good evening, Nurse Chen. I've been expecting you." Her voice was calm and articulate, with no signs of the speech disturbances often associated with acute psychiatric conditions. There was something about her tone that made me pause. It wasn't the voice of someone experiencing a psychiatric crisis. It was the voice of someone who was completely in control of their faculties and circumstances. I proceeded with the standard admission interview, asking about her medical history, current symptoms, and circumstances that led to her hospitalization. She answered most questions with, "I don't remember," or "I'm not sure," but her responses felt deliberate rather than confused. When I asked about her name, she said, "Names are just labels we use to categorize ourselves, don't you think? Sometimes it's better to exist without the limitations that names impose." It was an unusual response, but patients experiencing psychiatric episodes often have altered thought processes and unusual perspectives on seemingly simple questions. I documented her responses and continued with the assessment. When I asked about her family or emergency contacts, she said, "I don't think anyone is looking for me right now. Sometimes people need to disappear for a while to understand who they really are." Throughout our conversation, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable with the interaction, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. The patient was cooperative, polite, and showed no signs of agitation or distress. She answered questions appropriately, even if her answers were somewhat evasive or philosophical. But there was something about the way she looked at me during our conversation that made me feel like she was studying me rather than simply responding to my questions. After completing the admission assessment, I showed her around the unit, explaining our daily routines, meal times, and unit rules. She listened attentively and asked thoughtful questions about the facility and our treatment programs. Her questions were more sophisticated than those typically asked by patients in acute psychiatric crisis. She wanted to know about our staffing ratios, our security procedures, and our policies regarding patient discharge. When I asked if she had any concerns or needs for the night, she smiled in a way that made me take an involuntary step backward and said, "I think I have everything I need for now, Nurse Chen. Thank you for being so thorough in your orientation. I can tell you take your responsibilities very seriously." There was something in her tone that felt almost patronizing, as if she were evaluating my performance rather than expressing gratitude for care. I completed the admission documentation and returned to the nurse's station, where I found myself thinking about the interaction more than I typically would after admitting a new patient. There was something fundamentally different about this woman, something that didn't align with her supposed psychiatric condition or the circumstances that had brought her to our facility. She was too composed, too aware, too calculating for someone experiencing the kind of mental health crisis that would warrant acute psychiatric hospitalization. Around 1 a.m., I was making my first round of patient checks when I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The patient's room was dark, as expected for the late hour, but I could see her silhouette sitting upright in her chair by the window. She wasn't sleeping or lying down like most patients would be at that time of night. Instead, she appeared to be watching the parking lot below with focused attention. When I knocked softly and entered to check on her, she turned toward me with that same unsettling smile. "Nurse Chen, how punctual you are. I was wondering when you'd make your rounds." Her ability to predict my timing was concerning. Most patients don't pay attention to nursing schedules during their first night on the unit. "Are you having trouble sleeping?" I asked, noting her alertness in my documentation. "I can speak with Dr. Yamamoto about something to help you rest." "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary," she replied, still looking toward the window. "I prefer to stay aware of my surroundings. You never know what might happen during the night shift." The way she emphasized night shift made my skin crawl, though I couldn't explain why. I completed the safety check and moved on to the next patient, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me as I walked down the hallway. When I glanced back, her room appeared empty, but I had the distinct impression that she was positioned just out of sight, observing my movements. The next few hours passed without incident, though I found myself checking on her more frequently than medically necessary. Each time I looked into her room, she was in a different position. Sometimes sitting by the window, sometimes standing near the door, once lying on her bed but fully clothed and alert. She never seemed to actually sleep, which was highly unusual for a patient on their first night in an acute psychiatric facility. At 3:30 a.m., I was updating patient charts when I heard what sounded like whispering coming from the direction of her room. The acoustic design of our unit made it difficult to pinpoint exact sources of sound, but I was certain I could hear a conversation taking place. I walked quietly down the hallway and stopped outside her door, listening carefully. There were definitely two voices, one of which was clearly the patient's calm, measured tone. But I couldn't make out the second voice or determine what they were discussing. When I peered through the window, I could see her sitting on her bed, apparently talking to someone, but the room appeared to be empty, except for her. Patients experiencing auditory hallucinations often engage in conversations with voices only they can hear, so this behavior wasn't necessarily alarming from a psychiatric standpoint. But something about the rhythm and structure of her conversation suggested she was actually responding to another person rather than reacting to internal stimuli. I decided to enter the room to assess the situation more directly. When I knocked and opened the door, the conversation stopped immediately. The patient looked at me with an expression that seemed almost annoyed by the interruption. "Is everything all right?" I asked, scanning the room carefully. "I thought I heard voices." "Just talking to myself," she said, though her tone suggested she found my concern unnecessary. "Sometimes it helps to work through thoughts out loud. Surely you understand the value of verbal processing in psychiatric treatment." Her response was too clinically sophisticated for someone supposedly experiencing acute psychosis. Most patients in her condition wouldn't use terminology like verbal processing or demonstrate such awareness of therapeutic techniques. I made a mental note to discuss this with Dr. Yamamoto during morning rounds. "If you're hearing voices or having difficulty distinguishing reality from internal experiences, we have medications that can help," I offered, following standard nursing protocols for patients with possible psychotic symptoms. She laughed softly, but it wasn't the confused or distressed laughter often heard from psychiatric patients. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they find a situation genuinely amusing. "Nurse Chen, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that I'm perfectly aware of what's real and what isn't. Sometimes the distinction isn't as important as people think it is." I left her room feeling more unsettled than before. Her responses were too coherent, too philosophical, and too self-aware for someone experiencing the kind of psychiatric crisis that would warrant involuntary hospitalization. But more than that, there was something in her manner that suggested she was enjoying the interaction, as if my confusion and concern were entertaining to her. At 4:45 a.m., I was called to assist with another patient who was experiencing a panic attack. The intervention took about 20 minutes, during which I was focused entirely on providing crisis support and couldn't monitor the other patients on the unit. When I returned to my regular rounds, I discovered that the mysterious patient was no longer in her room. I checked the bathroom, the common areas, and the other patient rooms, thinking she might have wandered off during my absence. Our unit was secured, meaning patients couldn't leave without staff assistance, but they could move freely within the designated areas. After searching the entire accessible portion of the unit, I realized she was nowhere to be found. I immediately contacted security and initiated our missing patient protocol. Security reviewed the camera footage from the past hour, but found no evidence of the patient leaving her room or moving through any of the monitored areas. The cameras showed me entering and leaving her room during my earlier checks, but after my 3:30 a.m. visit, there was no further activity recorded in or around her room. The security officer who responded was Marcus Thompson, a veteran of the facility who had worked there for over 8 years. Marcus was thorough and professional, someone who took patient safety extremely seriously and had never missed anything important during his tenure. "Nurse Chen, I've reviewed all the footage from the past 2 hours," Marcus said, his expression troubled. "The cameras show you checking on her multiple times, but after your last visit, there's no record of her leaving the room. Yet when we check the room now, it's empty. We conducted a more extensive search of the facility, including areas that should have been inaccessible to patients. The medication room, storage closets, staff offices, and even the mechanical spaces were thoroughly examined. Every exit was monitored and secured, with no indication that anyone had attempted to leave the building. Dr. Yamamoto was contacted at home and arrived within 30 minutes to assist with the search and investigate the circumstances of the disappearance. She was as baffled as the rest of us by the patient's vanishing act. In 15 years of psychiatric practice, I've never encountered anything like this," Dr. Yamamoto admitted as we reviewed the case documentation. "Patients don't just disappear from secured units without leaving some trace of their departure." The police were notified, and detectives arrived to interview staff and review security footage. Detective Robert Chang, who had worked missing persons cases for over a decade, found the situation as perplexing as we did. "The security system here is comprehensive," Detective Chang noted after his initial investigation. "Multiple cameras, card access controls, and staff monitoring protocols should make it impossible for someone to simply vanish. Yet, that appears to be exactly what happened." What troubled me most was reviewing my interactions with the patient throughout the night. The more I thought about our conversations, the more I realized how calculated and deliberate her responses had been. She hadn't been experiencing psychiatric symptoms at all. She had been studying the unit, learning our procedures, and observing our routines with the methodical attention of someone planning something. The investigation continued for several days, but yielded no useful leads. The patient had left no fingerprints in her room, despite having been there for several hours. Her personal effects, which should have been stored in the unit's secure locker system, were also missing. Even the hospital gown and slippers she had been wearing were gone, though security footage showed no one entering or leaving the supply areas where replacement clothing was stored. Most disturbing of all, when Detective Chung attempted to verify the patient's admission through the emergency department, he discovered significant gaps in the documentation. While there were records of her initial police contact and transport to the hospital, the emergency department's computerized records showed no trace of her admission or initial psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Yamamoto's handwritten notes existed, but the electronic health record system had no corresponding entries. "It's as if someone systematically removed all digital traces of her presence here," Detective Chang explained during a follow-up meeting. "The paper trail exists, but every electronic record has been either deleted or corrupted." The technical explanation for the missing electronic records was attributed to a computer system malfunction that had affected patient data entry during the time of her admission. The IT department's analysis suggested that a software update had caused temporary database connectivity issues, resulting in incomplete record keeping. But the timing seemed too convenient. and the selective nature of the data loss was unprecedented in the hospital's electronic health record system. The case attracted attention from hospital administration, who launched their own internal investigation into the security breach and missing patient protocols. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the facility's chief medical officer, personally interviewed every staff member who had contact with the patient during her brief stay. The interviews revealed a disturbing pattern that none of us had noticed while it was happening. Every nurse, security guard, and support staff member who had interacted with the patient reported feeling unusually uncomfortable during their encounters, though none could articulate exactly why. Several described her as being too aware, or studying us instead of being treated by us. The evening shift nurse who had initially processed her admission mentioned that the patient had asked unusually specific questions about staffing schedules, security protocols, and patient discharge procedures. Looking back, it felt like she was conducting her own assessment of our facility rather than being assessed by us, said Jennifer Walsh, one of the evening shift nurses. She wanted to know which exits were monitored, how often we did patient checks, and what our emergency response procedures were. At the time, I thought she was just anxious about being in a new environment. The more we compared our individual experiences, the clearer it became that this woman had never been a psychiatric patient at all. She had been gathering intelligence about our operations from the moment she arrived on our unit. But for what purpose, and how had she orchestrated her admission in the first place? Detective Chang's investigation into the original police contact revealed additional inconsistencies. The officers who had reportedly found her downtown and brought her to the hospital had no record of the incident in their patrol logs. When Detective Chang contacted the officers directly, both claimed to have no memory of the encounter, despite the detailed police report that documented their interaction with her. "I've been working this beat for 12 years, Officer Michael Torres told Detective Chang. "I remember every person I've transported to Riverside, especially someone exhibiting psychiatric symptoms. But I have no recollection of this woman at all. It's like the report was filed by someone else using my badge number." The police report itself was authentic, filed through proper channels and containing accurate procedural language and formatting. But the officers whose names appeared on the document insisted they had never encountered the patient or filed any report about finding someone at Pioneer Courthouse Square on the night in question. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing details emerged. The security camera footage from downtown Portland showed no evidence of anyone matching the patient's description in the Pioneer Courthouse Square area during the time frame specified in the police report. The bench where she was supposedly found was clearly visible in multiple camera angles throughout that night, and no one was ever seen sitting there. Hospital administration brought in external cybersecurity consultants to analyze the electronic health record system and determine how the patient's digital records had been compromised. The consultants' preliminary findings were unlike anything they had encountered in healthcare data breaches. "The deletion pattern is extremely sophisticated," explained Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead cybersecurity analyst. "This wasn't a simple hack or system malfunction. Someone with intimate knowledge of the hospital's database architecture methodically removed specific data points while leaving surrounding records intact. It would require administrative access and detailed understanding of the system's backup protocols." The investigation revealed that the data deletion had occurred in real time as the patient was being processed through the hospital. As each electronic record was created during her admission, it was simultaneously being deleted from backup servers and archive systems. The process required coordination between multiple access points and suggested either an inside job or an external party, with unprecedented access to the hospital's IT infrastructure. I found myself unable to concentrate during subsequent shifts. Every time I walked past the room where she had stayed, I remembered her unsettling smile and the way she had seemed to anticipate my every move. The memory of her voice saying, "I've been expecting you," when I first introduced myself, played on repeat in my mind. How had she known my name before I told her? How had she known when I would be making my rounds? My sleep was disrupted by dreams where I was walking through the psychiatric unit, conducting patient checks, only to find that every room was empty except for her. In these dreams, she would be sitting in different rooms each time I looked, always watching me with that same calculating expression, always one step ahead of wherever I expected to find her. 3 weeks after her disappearance, I was working another night shift when I received a phone call that made my blood run cold. The call came through the main hospital switchboard at 2:47 a.m., the same time I'd heard her whispering in her room on the night she vanished. "Nurse Chen," said a familiar voice that I recognized immediately, despite hoping I would never hear it again. "I wanted to thank you for the excellent care you provided during my stay. Your attention to detail was particularly impressive." I stood frozen at the nurse's station, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The caller ID showed the call was coming from within the hospital, but I knew that was impossible. Our unit was fully staffed, and I could see every patient in their rooms through the glass windows of the nurse's station. "Who is this?" I managed to whisper, though I knew exactly who it was. "I think you know the answer to that question, Nurse Chen. I'm calling to let you know that your dedication to understanding difficult cases was noted and appreciated. Not everyone would have been so thorough in their observations." The implication was clear. She knew I had been paying close attention to her behavior during her stay. She knew I had documented every unusual interaction and shared my concerns with the medical team. Somehow, she had been monitoring the investigation into her disappearance. "What do you want?" I asked, looking around the unit frantically to make sure all patients were accounted for and all staff were visible. "I want you to know that your curiosity about my case was admirable. But sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions about things you don't understand." The field of psychiatric nursing can be very challenging, especially when you encounter cases that don't fit standard diagnostic categories. Her tone was calm and professional, almost clinical, as if she were providing medical advice rather than delivering what felt unmistakably like a threat. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but the message was unmistakably clear. She knew who I was, where I worked, and how her case had affected me. "You might want to consider a different specialty, Nurse Chen. Pediatric nursing, perhaps. Working with children can be much more predictable than dealing with adult psychiatric patients. Sometimes it's better to work with cases that have clear solutions." The line went dead, and I immediately contacted security and hospital administration. The phone system logs showed no record of any incoming call at 2:47 a.m. The switchboard operator insisted that no calls had been transferred to the psychiatric unit during that time period. Yet I had clearly received the call, and other staff members had seen me answering the phone and documented the time in their shift notes. The technical explanation provided by the IT department was that the phone system had experienced a routing error that caused an external call to appear as if it were coming from within the hospital. But they could find no record of the call in the system logs, no trace of the connection, and no explanation for how someone could have bypassed the hospital's security protocols to reach my direct extension. I submitted my resignation the following week. In my resignation letter, I cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue opportunities in different healthcare settings. But the truth was that I could no longer function effectively in psychiatric nursing, knowing that there were cases and situations that defied every principle I had learned about mental health treatment and patient care. The experience had shaken my confidence in my ability to assess patients accurately and provide appropriate care. If I couldn't distinguish between a genuine psychiatric patient and someone who was manipulating the system for unknown purposes, how could I trust my clinical judgment with other patients? The thought of missing important signs and symptoms because I was second-guessing my observations was terrifying. More than that, the case had introduced me to possibilities I wasn't prepared to accept. The systematic deletion of electronic records, the false police reports, the officers with no memory of their documented interactions, and the sophisticated knowledge of hospital protocols displayed by someone who was supposedly experiencing acute psychosis suggested a level of organization and capability that challenged my understanding of what was possible. During my final week at Riverside, I learned that I wasn't the first staff member to leave after encountering unusual patients. Over the past 3 years, 7 nurses and 2 security guards had resigned within months of working shifts involving patients with similar presentations. All had been experienced healthcare professionals with excellent performance records. All had left citing burnout or desire for career changes. None had provided detailed explanations for their departures. When I spoke confidentially with 2 of the former nurses, both described experiences that paralleled mine. Patients who seemed too aware and calculating for their supposed diagnoses. Interactions that felt more like interrogations than therapeutic encounters. Electronic records that mysteriously disappeared or became corrupted. And phone calls or contact after the patient's discharge or disappearance that made them question their safety and career choices. There are things happening in that facility that don't make sense from a medical standpoint, one former nurse told me during a coffee meeting weeks after my resignation. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, that my imagination was getting the better of me. But when you start seeing patterns across multiple cases, you have to consider that something systematic is happening. The pattern suggested that Riverside Mental Health Facility was being used as more than just a psychiatric treatment center. Someone was using the facility's admission processes and security protocols for purposes that had nothing to do with mental health care. But who was orchestrating these operations, and what were they trying to accomplish? I moved to a different city and found work at a pediatric clinic, following the suggestion that had been made during that unsettling phone call. The work was indeed more predictable, dealing with routine childhood illnesses, vaccinations, and development concerns. But even in this new environment, I found myself analyzing patient interactions more carefully than I ever had before, wondering if what I was seeing was genuine or if there were layers of deception I wasn't sophisticated enough to detect. The case of the vanishing patient changed how I viewed the healthcare system and the assumptions we make about the people who seek treatment. It forced me to consider that not everyone who enters a medical facility is there for legitimate medical reasons, and that the systems we rely on to verify identities and maintain security might be more vulnerable than we realize. But most importantly, it taught me that there are aspects of human behavior and organizational manipulation that extend far beyond what we learn in nursing school or medical training. The woman who disappeared from Riverside wasn't suffering from a psychiatric condition. She was conducting some kind of operation that required temporary access to a secure medical facility, and she had the resources and knowledge to orchestrate her admission, gather whatever information she needed, and vanish without leaving a trace. 6 months after leaving Riverside, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, remembering her voice on the phone and wondering if I made the right decision to leave psychiatric nursing. Part of me wonders if I should have stayed and tried to understand what was happening at that facility. But a larger part of me knows that I encountered something dangerous and sophisticated that I wasn't equipped to handle, and that walking away was the only sensible choice. The case remains officially unsolved, classified as a missing patient incident with unusual circumstances. But for those of us who were there that night, it represents something much more significant than a hospital security breach. It was an introduction to the reality that the world contains organized operations and capable individuals who can manipulate institutional systems in ways that most people would never imagine possible. The investigation into my former patient's disappearance took an unexpected turn about 2 months after I had left Riverside. Detective Chang contacted me at my new job to inform me that similar incidents had been reported at psychiatric facilities across the Pacific Northwest. Over the past 18 months, at least 6 other hospitals had experienced nearly identical cases. Mysterious patients admitted under questionable circumstances, sophisticated behavior that didn't match their supposed psychiatric conditions, and subsequent disappearances that left no digital traces. We're looking at a pattern that extends far beyond your facility, Detective Chang explained during our phone conversation. Each case involves a patient who displayed unusual awareness of hospital protocols, asked specific questions about security procedures, and then vanished in ways that shouldn't be possible given the facility's safety measures. What made these cases even more disturbing was the geographic distribution. The incidents had occurred at facilities in Seattle, Spokane, Eugene, and smaller cities throughout Oregon and Washington. The patients were always different individuals, but their behavior patterns and methods of disappearance were remarkably consistent. In every case, electronic medical records had been systematically deleted, and hospital staff reported feeling unsettled by interactions with the patients. Detective Chang had been working with federal investigators to determine if these incidents were connected to some form of organized criminal activity. The level of sophistication required to repeatedly breach hospital security systems and manipulate admission processes suggested resources and coordination beyond what typical criminals could access. We're dealing with people who understand healthcare systems intimately, Detective Chung continued. They know how to exploit admission procedures, navigate institutional hierarchies, and compromise digital security measures. This isn't random criminal activity. It's planned and executed by individuals with specialized knowledge and significant technical capabilities. The federal investigation had revealed that each of the targeted facilities shared certain characteristics. They were all mid-sized psychiatric hospitals with modern electronic health record systems, comprehensive security measures, and patient populations that included individuals with government security clearances or connections to sensitive industries. Riverside fit this profile perfectly, as several of our patients had been current or former employees of technology companies, defense contractors, or government agencies. The working theory among investigators was that these mysterious patients were conducting intelligence-gathering operations, using psychiatric facilities as cover to access information about specific individuals or to test institutional security vulnerabilities. The psychiatric hospital setting provided an ideal environment for such operations because patients were expected to exhibit unusual behavior, and staff were trained to be patient and accommodating with individuals experiencing mental health crises. Think about it from an operational standpoint, Detective Chang explained. If you wanted to study how a secure facility operates, observe staff routines, and test security protocols, posing as a psychiatric patient would give you remarkable access while providing a built-in excuse for any suspicious behavior. This perspective reframed everything I had observed during my encounter with the vanishing patient. Her methodical questions about staffing schedules, security procedures, and discharge protocols hadn't been symptoms of psychiatric illness. They had been intelligence-gathering activities conducted under the cover of supposed mental health treatment. Her calm demeanor and sophisticated vocabulary hadn't been inconsistent with her diagnosis. They had been evidence that she was never actually experiencing psychiatric symptoms at all. The realization that I had been unknowingly participating in some form of espionage operation was deeply unsettling. Every interaction I had documented, every observation I had shared with the medical team, every detail I had recorded in her patient chart had potentially been part of her intelligence-gathering process. She had been studying not just the facility's operations, but also how staff members responded to unusual patient presentations. Detective Chang informed me that several of the nurses and security personnel from the other affected facilities had also received mysterious phone calls after their patients disappeared. The calls always occurred during night shifts, always came through the hospital's internal phone system, and always left no trace in the telecommunications logs. The callers demonstrated detailed knowledge of the staff members' work schedules, patient assignments, and personal concerns about the cases. The psychological impact on healthcare workers has been significant, Detective Chang noted. 8 nurses and 3 security guards have left their positions at the affected facilities, citing stress and safety concerns. The pattern suggests that intimidating healthcare workers into leaving their jobs might be a secondary objective of these operations. The federal investigators had been working with cybersecurity experts to understand how the electronic health record systems were being compromised. The technical analysis revealed that the deletions were occurring in real time as patient information was being entered into the systems. This required not only administrative access to the hospital networks, but also sophisticated knowledge of database architecture and backup protocols. We're looking at state-level capabilities, Detective Chang explained. The technical sophistication and coordination required for these operations suggests involvement by individuals with intelligence community training or resources. This isn't corporate espionage or typical cybercrime. It's something much more serious. The possibility that foreign intelligence services might be using psychiatric facilities to conduct operations on American soil was both terrifying and plausible. Psychiatric hospitals would provide excellent cover for intelligence operatives, offering access to information about individuals with security clearances while allowing unusual behavior to be dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. 3 months after this conversation with Detective Chang, I received another phone call that confirmed my worst fears about the case. I was working a day shift at the pediatric clinic when the receptionist transferred a call to my desk. The voice was different from the one I had heard at Riverside, but the tone and cadence were unmistakably similar. "Nurse Chen, I hope you're enjoying your work with children. Pediatric nursing suits you much better than psychiatric care." The caller paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Your new position at Sunrise Pediatric Associates has been keeping you busy. Dr. Martinez speaks very highly of your clinical skills and dedication to patient care. My hands started shaking as I realized the caller knew not only where I was working, but also details about my performance evaluations and relationship with my supervising physician. The level of surveillance and information gathering demonstrated by this phone call was far beyond what I had experienced at Riverside. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, looking around the clinic to make sure no patients or families were within earshot. "We want you to understand that your discretion regarding unusual cases is appreciated. Healthcare professionals who demonstrate good judgment about when to ask questions and when to simply document observations make valuable contributors to their communities." The caller's emphasis on discretion and documentation made it clear that my decision to leave psychiatric nursing and avoid discussing the Riverside case had been noticed and approved. But the implication was equally clear. Continued silence was expected, and my compliance was being monitored. "The field of pediatric nursing offers many opportunities for professional growth," the caller continued. "Dr. Martinez has mentioned that you might be interested in pursuing additional certifications in pediatric emergency medicine. Such specialization could lead to excellent career advancement opportunities." The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but the message was unmistakable. My career trajectory, my professional relationships, and my personal safety were all being monitored by individuals with access to detailed information about my life. The suggestion that I pursue emergency medicine certification wasn't career advice. It was guidance about where my skills might be most useful to whatever organization was behind these operations. After the call ended, I sat at my desk for nearly an hour, trying to process the implications of what I had just experienced. The investigation into psychiatric facility security breaches had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple criminal enterprise. I was dealing with individuals or organizations that had the resources to conduct long-term surveillance of healthcare workers, manipulate institutional systems across multiple states, and influence career decisions through a combination of implied threats and seemingly helpful suggestions. I began researching pediatric emergency medicine programs that evening, not because I was genuinely interested in the specialization, but because I understood that my compliance with the caller's suggestions was being monitored and evaluated. The realization that my career decisions were no longer entirely my own was deeply disturbing. But the alternative, continued resistance or investigation, seemed far more dangerous. Over the following months, I noticed subtle changes in my work environment that suggested continued surveillance. Colleagues would occasionally mention conversations or observations that I was certain I had never shared with them. My supervisor began assigning me to cases involving children from families with government or military connections, despite my lack of specialized training in security-related pediatric care. The clinic's computer systems experienced periodic technical difficulties that required visits from IT specialists who asked unusually detailed questions about patient data access and documentation procedures. The pattern of surveillance and influence was sophisticated and persistent, designed to guide my professional development while ensuring my continued cooperation with whatever agenda was driving these operations. I was being shaped into a more useful asset while being reminded of the consequences of non-compliance. 6 months after the second phone call, I was approached by a colleague who claimed to have information about similar experiences among healthcare workers in our region. Dr. Amanda Foster, who worked at a nearby hospital emergency department, invited me for coffee to discuss what she described as unusual patterns in patient presentations and institutional behavior. During our meeting, Dr. Foster revealed that she had been tracking reports of mysterious patients and subsequent healthcare worker resignations across the Pacific Northwest for over 2 years. Her research had identified more than 30 cases involving patients whose behavior and subsequent disappearances didn't align with standard medical explanations. The pattern extends beyond psychiatric facilities, Dr. Foster explained, showing me a detailed spreadsheet of incidents she had compiled. Emergency departments, intensive care units, and specialized medical centers have all experienced similar cases. Patients who demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of medical procedures, ask specific questions about hospital operations, and then disappear in ways that leave no digital traces. Dr. Foster's analysis suggested that multiple healthcare institutions were being systematically studied and tested by individuals with extensive medical knowledge and technical capabilities. The operations were designed to gather intelligence about institutional vulnerabilities while identifying healthcare workers who might be useful for future recruitment or manipulation. They're building a network, Dr. Foster continued. Healthcare professionals who demonstrate particular skills or access to sensitive patient populations are being identified, monitored, and gradually influenced to move into positions where they can be more useful. Your transition from psychiatric nursing to pediatric care, and the suggestion that you pursue emergency medicine certification fits this pattern perfectly. The scope of what Dr. Foster was describing was overwhelming and terrifying. If her analysis was correct, I wasn't just a witness to isolated criminal activity. I was part of a systematic effort to infiltrate and manipulate healthcare systems across an entire region. The implications for patient safety, institutional security, and national security were staggering. Dr. Foster had been documenting her findings and sharing them with federal investigators, but the complexity and scope of the operations made traditional law enforcement responses inadequate. The individuals behind these activities had demonstrated capabilities that suggested state-level resources and intelligence community training. The question isn't just what they're doing, Dr. Foster explained. It's what they're preparing for. This level of healthcare system infiltration and surveillance suggests they're building capabilities for something much larger than intelligence gathering. They're positioning assets for operations that would require extensive access to medical facilities and personnel. As I listened to Dr. Foster's analysis, I realized that my experience at Riverside had been just one small component of a much larger and more sophisticated operation. The vanishing patient hadn't been conducting a simple reconnaissance mission. She had been part of a systematic effort to map and infiltrate healthcare infrastructure across multiple states. The phone calls I had received weren't just intimidation tactics. They were part of an ongoing recruitment and control process designed to turn healthcare workers into unwitting assets. My career guidance wasn't coincidental. It was deliberate manipulation intended to position me where I would be most useful for future operations. Understanding the true scope of what I had become involved in was both enlightening and paralyzing. I now knew that my professional choices were being influenced by individuals with agendas that extended far beyond healthcare. But I also knew that resistance would likely result in consequences that I wasn't prepared to face. The realization that I was trapped in a system of surveillance and manipulation that I couldn't escape or expose without significant personal risk was the most frightening aspect of the entire experience. I had become a reluctant participant in operations that I didn't understand, conducted by people I couldn't identify, for purposes that remained hidden from me. Dr. Foster suggested that documenting our experiences and sharing information with other affected healthcare workers might be the only way to understand and potentially resist these operations. But she also acknowledged that such efforts carried significant risks and might result in escalated surveillance or more direct intervention by whoever was orchestrating these activities. The choice between passive compliance and active resistance would define not just my career, but potentially my safety and the safety of others who had become unwittingly involved in these mysterious operations. The vanishing patient from Riverside had introduced me to a world of institutional manipulation and surveillance that I was still struggling to comprehend. And the decisions I made about how to respond would have consequences that extended far beyond my individual circumstances. The weight of Dr. Foster's revelations settled over me like a suffocating blanket. As we sat in that coffee shop, surrounded by the mundane conversations of people living normal lives, I felt the ground beneath my understanding of reality shift permanently. The choice she was presenting wasn't really a choice at all. I could either accept my role as a manipulated asset in whatever larger operation was unfolding, or I could risk everything by attempting to expose activities that clearly involved individuals with resources I couldn't comprehend. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment, replaying every interaction I'd had since leaving Riverside. The casual comments from colleagues that had seemed like innocent small talk now felt like evidence of ongoing surveillance. The technical difficulties with computer systems that had required specialized IT support suddenly appeared to be deliberate intrusions designed to assess and potentially compromise data security. Even my apartment lease renewal had involved paperwork processed unusually quickly, with rental references that I didn't remember providing. I began to notice things I'd previously dismissed as coincidental. The same maintenance worker had appeared at both my workplace and my apartment building, always friendly, present during and professional, but times when I was discussing sensitive topics with colleagues or making phone calls. A woman in a blue sedan had been parked across from the pediatric clinic on multiple occasions, always reading or using her phone, never seeming to notice my comings and goings, but consistently present during my shift changes. The realization that my daily life was being monitored with such thoroughness was both infuriating and paralyzing. Every conversation, every phone call, every professional interaction was potentially being recorded and analyzed by people whose identities and motivations remained completely hidden from me. The privacy I had taken for granted as a basic human right had apparently been stripped away without my knowledge or consent. 3 days after my meeting with Dr. Foster, I received a text message that made my blood run cold. The message came from an unknown number and contained only a photograph of me sitting in the coffee shop with Dr. Foster, taken from an angle that suggested someone had been watching us from across the street. Attached to the image was a single line of text. Professional development conversations are always valuable. We hope you found the discussion enlightening. The message was a clear demonstration that my meeting with Dr. Foster had been observed and documented. More disturbing was the implication that my conversations about the mysterious patient cases were being monitored in real time. The individuals behind these operations weren't just conducting surveillance, they were actively managing my interactions with other healthcare workers who might have similar experiences or information. I deleted the text message immediately, but I knew the damage was already done. My attempt to understand what was happening by connecting with Dr. Foster had been anticipated and neutralized. The photograph served as both evidence of their capabilities and a warning about the consequences of continuing to investigate these activities. Dr. Foster called me 2 days later, but our conversation was brief and stilted. She mentioned that she had decided to focus more on her clinical work and less on research into unusual patient cases. Her tone suggested that she had received her own warnings about continuing to document and analyze the patterns she had been tracking. Without explicitly saying so, she was letting me know that her investigation was ending and that she couldn't provide any further assistance or information. The systematic silencing of healthcare workers who had begun to recognize the patterns was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire operation. Dr. Foster had compiled extensive documentation of incidents across multiple facilities, but her sudden withdrawal from the investigation meant that crucial information was being lost or suppressed. Other healthcare workers who might have valuable insights were being intimidated into silence before they could share their experiences or coordinate their responses. I realized that isolation was a key component of their control strategy. By ensuring that affected healthcare workers couldn't communicate effectively with each other, the individuals behind these operations prevented us from understanding the full scope of what was happening or organizing any kind of collective response. Each of us was dealing with our experiences in isolation, making us more vulnerable to manipulation and less likely to resist their influence. The Pediatric Emergency Medicine Certification Program that had been suggested during my second mysterious phone call suddenly became less of a suggestion and more of a requirement. My supervisor, Dr. Martinez, approached me during a particularly busy shift to discuss my professional development goals. She had apparently been contacted by someone claiming to represent a medical education foundation that was offering scholarships for specialized training programs. "Sarah, I've been thinking about your career trajectory," Dr. Martinez said, pulling me aside during a brief lull in patient flow. "You've shown excellent clinical instincts and remarkable composure during emergency situations. There's a pediatric emergency medicine program at Oregon Health Sciences University that would be perfect for someone with your skills and experience." The conversation felt rehearsed, as if Dr. Martinez was delivering information that had been provided to her rather than expressing her own professional opinions. She mentioned specific details about the program that seemed unusually well-researched for a casual career discussion, including information about faculty members, clinical rotations, and fellowship opportunities that would typically require extensive investigation to obtain. The foundation representative mentioned that they had reviewed your clinical performance records and were particularly impressed with your ability to remain calm during complex cases. Dr. Martinez continued. They're prepared to offer full financial support for the program, including tuition, books, and a living stipend during your training period. The offer was extraordinarily generous, far beyond what legitimate medical education foundations typically provided to individual healthcare workers. The level of financial support being offered suggested that someone was very interested in ensuring my participation in this specific training program. But the more attractive the offer appeared, the more suspicious I became about the underlying motivations. I told Dr. Martinez that I would consider the opportunity and requested time to review the program details and application requirements. But even as I expressed interest in the position, I was analyzing every aspect of the offer for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. The timing, the financial incentives, and the specific focus on pediatric emergency medicine all seemed designed to move me into a position where I would have access to sensitive patient populations and emergency response protocols. That evening, I researched the Medical Education Foundation that was supposedly offering the scholarship. The organization existed and appeared to be legitimate, with a professional website, documented charitable activities, and a history of supporting healthcare worker education. But deeper investigation revealed that the foundation had been established only 18 months earlier, and its funding sources were remarkably opaque for a charitable organization. The foundation's board of directors included individuals with impressive medical credentials, but several had employment histories that included positions with government agencies, defense contractors, and international consulting firms. The pattern suggested that the foundation might be a front organization designed to provide cover for activities that extended beyond medical education. My suspicions were confirmed when I attempted to contact other recipients of the foundation's scholarships. The foundation's website listed dozens of healthcare workers who had supposedly received funding for specialized training programs. But when I tried to reach several of them through professional networks and hospital directories, I discovered that many either didn't exist or had left their positions shortly after completing their training. The healthcare workers I was able to contact were reluctant to discuss their experiences with the foundation or their subsequent career changes. Their responses were carefully worded and evasive, suggesting they had been instructed about what information they could and couldn't share. The pattern was consistent with other aspects of the larger operation. Healthcare workers were being recruited, trained, and positioned through seemingly legitimate channels, but their subsequent activities were being controlled and monitored by individuals with hidden agendas. That was my first and last shift as a psychiatric nurse, and it changed everything I thought I knew about healthcare and the systems we trust to protect us. The woman who vanished from Riverside wasn't a patient at all. She was part of something much larger and more organized than I could have imagined. The phone calls, the surveillance, the career manipulation, the scholarship offers that were too good to be true. All of it was designed to turn healthcare workers like me into unwitting assets for operations we couldn't understand or escape. I never did find out who they really were or what they were ultimately planning. But I know that somewhere out there, they're still watching, still recruiting, still positioning people like me exactly where they need us to be. Sometimes I wonder if sharing this story was a mistake, if it will bring them back into my life. But maybe that's exactly what they're counting on. That fear will keep us all silent while they continue building whatever network they've been constructing through our hospitals and clinics. If you work in healthcare and you've encountered patients who seem too aware, too calculating, who ask too many questions about your protocols and procedures, pay attention to that instinct. And if you've received mysterious phone calls or career opportunities that seem too convenient, you might already be part of their operation, whether you realize it or not.